around iron and struggle, Ethel Payne, the First Lady of the Black Press. And I have a copy of the book in the room, and I'll start passing these around so you can see them. Sonja Williams of Howard University, Word Warrior, Richard Durham, Word Warrior, Richard Durham, Radio and Freedom. We also have Sid Bedingfield of the University of Minnesota, Newspaper Wars, Civil Rights and White Resistance in South Carolina, 1935 to 1965. He is in press. And so I have some leaflets from the University of Illinois Press on his book, which we will be able to order and May. Good. So that means you're in the summer catalog?
It's fall.
Fall. Okay. All right. Then we also have Dolores Flamiano, my colleague from James Madison University, whose book Women, Workers, and Race in Life magazine also meets reformed photojournalism, 1934 to 1955, and as well. And then we have Michael DiBari, Advancing the Civil Rights Movement, Race and Geography of Life magazine's visual representation. He's from Hampton University, and this is hot off the press. So, yes, it is brand spanking new, and it was really exciting to me as I was hoping to create a conversation here among the authors, and then as I was looking at sourcing and that sort of thing, in Michael's book last night, I noticed that he had cited Dolores, so they're already in conversation. So, in any case, we're going to start out. I've asked each author to prepare a 5-minute overview of the book, perhaps focusing on why they wrote the book or something, why when you write a book, you are indulging in obsession. I don't know any other way to put it. You're living and breathing whatever this subject matter is, and your family gets tired of hearing about it. Your colleagues know, oh, you're doing that. It comes to define you. And so what I want to do is hear from each of the authors why it was necessary, why you felt compelled to do this work. And we're going to start with James, and then we're going to just pretty much, I think, go down the list.
Hey, everybody. Good morning.
Yeah.
Good morning. Well, it was a number of years ago. I write books for a living. I'm not an academic, and I was looking for a new subject for my next biography. And I went to Google and asked to produce a list of the 100 top journalists of the 20th century. I'm getting an echo. Are you guys okay?
We're cutting out a little bit, audio-wise.
Okay. And Ethel Payne's name showed up on a number of these lists. And like most white Americans, I had no idea who she was. And I began looking into her life and discovered that she was this extraordinarily important journalist who had worked for the Chicago Defender, critical period in civil rights history. And I thought this would make a terrific book. And when you figure that out, you begin to look for resources. So I found that her papers were spread around 4 different places. The papers of the Library of Congress were in pristine shape, well organized, and had been used by several people. The papers at Schomburg in New York had never been opened since her death and had been given there. They'd never been cataloged, never been looked at. And the papers at Howard University had been looked at, but they'd never really been organized or properly prepared for research. Except Chicago. And I realized at this point, 20 years after her death, that she was not only overdue for a biography, but no one was doing one. And after some struggles, I got permission to use the catalog papers and set out at work to do this book. What I discovered along the way is what I hope particularly my white readers learn, which is the significant role of the Chicago Defender in American history. All of you at this conference, I don't need to give you a lesson on the Defender, but it started in 1905, and what the public at large doesn't understand is the Chicago Defender was no more a Chicago newspaper than, say, the New York Times was merely a New York newspaper. Its influence nationally was enormous. It was a part of the reason for the Great Migration. And it became an outstanding advocate for desegregation and civil rights. And Payne, who was born in 1911 in Chicago, grew up in the shadow of this paper. But, and my book tells the story of her frustration trying to find a professional job as a black woman in Chicago in the 30s and 40s, which was impossible. She joined the paper in 1950-51 after coming back from working in Japan and went to Washington very soon thereafter as their correspondent. She was basically untrained journalist. She'd taken 2 writing courses at Northwestern University. But she was very much like a jazz singer in that she was trained by being in the band. But what she had, which other people don't necessarily have, and you don't get from training, is that that make you a journalist. Pursuit of the story, the sense there is a story. And her job as a journalist in Washington, to my mind, was fascinating because it illustrates some of the great powers of journalism. She would be shocked today to see the kind of thing that masquerades as journalism, particularly on television, of people just screaming and yelling at each other, and the world of alternative facts. Her use of journalism was twofold. One was to bring questions to people in power, questions that they had never confronted. So famously, she confronted Eisenhower over desegregation questions as one of 3 blacks in a mostly male press. And when she did so, she had to have her questions not only ask questions of the president, but also inform him as well as the principal to the issues. That's why her questions were long-winded. Her colleagues had no idea about the key issues involving civil rights, so she had to educate them. But the thing she learned in doing so is that by asking questions of the president in a public forum like a national press conference, she was able to use the power of journalism to put those issues on the national agenda. And in my book, I give examples of stories such as the exclusion of the Howard University choir from an event that the president was at that none of the newspapers had covered until she asked the question at the press conference. So the LA Times, New York Times, other papers began to have to cover things merely because she was asking this tough question. And the third thing she did, using, I think, a really important underestimated power of journalism, is to merely light the dark recesses of society, to report on things. So when she went to Montgomery to report on the bus boycott, she wasn't advocating anything, but by reporting on it, she was activating readers of the Chicago Defender and creating a link between the front line of the civil rights movement and blacks all around the country who were reading the Chicago Defender. So that's sort of a summation of her life and her book. Obviously, I could go on chapters. The last question I was asked to address is there a strong interest in terms of publishing opportunities for civil rights and media history? And I'm afraid my answer is no, not in the trade publishing world. In the academic publishing world, I think there is. But when my book came out, I'll compare it to writing a book about Joseph Pulitzer. When my biography of Joseph Pulitzer came out, you'd find it on the front tables, bookstores, and stacks. And there was no Jewish Hungarian section of the bookstore. When this book came out, it was only felt right away in areas like black interest or African American history. So the casual reader coming into a bookstore would not be exposed to it. And that kind of segregation in publishing is still very strong and still very active. And so, I bring you a close with the question that 2 people asked me when I set up to do this work, which was, why are you writing a book for black readers? And I thought, it's a good question, because I thought the story of Ethel Payne was for everybody.
Thank you.
Those are thoughts for this morning.
Thank you.
And thank you for having me through this Skype. I'm sorry I can't travel to be with you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Sonja.
Good morning.
All right, James, we're going to lose your video here.
That's fine. I can hear you.
All right. Thank you for coming. And I was going to ask a quick question. How many people have heard of Richard Durham? Okay, one. All right, no problem. About 20 years ago, two. About 20 years ago, I was the same way. I had the opportunity to work on a series called Black Radio, Telling It Like It Was, for the Smithsonian. It was a public radio series that aired nationwide. And so one of the shows, I was responsible for producing and writing 5 shows. One dealt with what happened with blacks in radio during the 30s and 40s. So a couple of my colleagues at Howard said, well, if you're going to do that period, you have to talk about this man, Richard Durham, who was a writer, really a phenomenal writer, and his entrance into the media was through radio in the 30s and 40s. And he produced a series called Destination Freedom. And this is just an advertisement from Destination Freedom. They used to have coffee, they call them coffee coolers, but it was Sunday evening and you could go and meet the cast members as well as Durham. So why did I decide to write a book about this man? Well, when I heard the series, I was just enthralled. And so what I wanted to do is just play like a minute of one of the pieces from the series. It aired, by the way, on WMAQ, which obviously still is the NBC affiliate station in Chicago, one of the top stations in that city. And it was on a weekly basis. It was a half-an-hour dramatic series that looked at black men and women heroes and their contributions, not just to the black community, but to America in general. And basically, they were freedom fighters in their own fields, everything from scientists, mathematicians, teachers, authors, writers, you name it. This is one of Durham's favorite episodes about Denmark Vesey, the South Carolina former slave who led a slave revolt in 1822. So this is at the end when his revolt was squashed and he was put on trial for treason against the state of South Carolina. And this is the trial.
Denmark, Vesey.
Yes, Your Honor.
You set out to slaughter your master and change the state. Before I pass sentence, do you have a word to explain your crimes?
You speak of my crimes. I felt to be idle while other men thought to be free was a crime.
Is that all you can say to explain your treachery?
My treachery began when I read the Declaration of Independence. It said all men are created equal. It grew when I read that black Crispus Attucks died to help the colonies become free. Then I read what Ben Franklin, Tom Paine, Lafayette, and Jefferson had said. They wanted that revolution to make all men free and equal, but they stopped with some men free and some men slaves. If my life is the price I pay to be free, take it. But until all men are free and equal, the revolution goes on.
Sometimes when I play this for my students, they hear that organ at the end and say, wow, that's old time. But they get into the story because it's really about the story. And think about it. This is 1948, and you have a black character, a black man, really a man who lived in the world, who's talking about freedom and saying until all men are free and equal, the revolution will continue. That is just unheard of on radio during the 40s. So I said, who is this guy? And how did he get to, one, have this weekly series on for 2 years on WMAQ? And basically throughout his life, as I found out during my research, he was not only a dramatist, he was a journalist, he was an activist, and he used his words as weapons in the service of freedom, justice, and equality. 4 years before this series started airing on WMAQ, he was a journalist. He worked for the Chicago Defender. So Jamie and I had talked often about the synergy between, say, Ethel Payne and he, although Ethel Payne was based in Washington, D.C., and Richard Durham lived in Chicago for most of his life. This is just an article that he wrote, and he was an investigative reporter for the Chicago Defender. Most of his stories ended up on the front page. He won many awards and accolades for it. This is a story that he wrote in 1944, which was an election year. FDR was running again for his unprecedented fourth term, and he was running against Republican Thomas Dewey, a New Yorker, governor of New York, and he went to his Michigan hometown to interview his mother. She made some anti-Semitic statements, and of course that made the news and caused a little bit of a ruckus in New York. So just to show you that he was unapologetic about going after the truth and exposing that in all forms. During the 50s, he worked as a labor union organizer and writer. And then in the 60s, he was hired by the Nation of Islam to edit their national newspaper, the Muhammad Speaks. And so he worked there, and they covered issues. In fact, one of their mottos was that we're going to present information that deals with freedom and justice and equality in the world. So they covered issues about what was happening in Chicago, of course, what was happening in Africa, in southern Rhodesia, today Zimbabwe, and of course in Vietnam and the Middle East. So it was not a paper that just dealt with the news of the Nation of Islam. It dealt with the world, which is why I think it had such currency in the Black community. As a result of his interaction and his editorship of the Muhammad Speaks newspaper, he became friends with this gentleman. I think you all know this. And so from 1970 until about 1975, when the book came out, he followed Ali everywhere to write The Greatest, My Own Story, Muhammad Ali's autobiography. And so he was the credited ghostwriter of this book. And this is just the German version of the book. It came out in many languages, but it was a good seller, and he was the voice behind that book, trying to bring Muhammad Ali's life into focus. Then in the 80s, this is in the 70s, in the 80s he became a speechwriter for several politicians in Chicago, including the man who became the first Black mayor of Chicago, Harold Washington. And so he had a career that was really broad. His influences and his colleagues included people like Toni Morrison, Langston Hughes, Vernon Jarrett, and others, so that he not only interacted with these people, but he collaborated with them. He was a force, and that's what brought me to him and to the decision to write about his life, which really spanned from 1917 until he died in 1984. So, thank you, and I'm sure we'll talk more.
Thank you for inviting me. I was very humbled to be asked to be on this panel. My book just came out about a month ago. I was very excited. My story is not I think it's very different in the sense that I went to grad school. I was a newspaper photographer, and I kind of fell into getting a PhD, not knowing exactly what it was about. So the book stemmed from my dissertation. When I was thinking about what to do, again, not knowing what it entailed to write a dissertation, the faculty at Ohio University helped me and really kind of mentored me and got me to where I am, and I attribute it all to them. So I was thinking about what kind of topic to write about, and as a photographer, you look at what moves you, what motivates you in photographs, and I wanted to do something with pictures, and I found out that there is not as much research done on images as broadcast newspapers and other types of media. So I wanted to do something that had moving pictures, and the civil rights movement was one of the most contentious periods in our history. And Life magazine published many of those pictures, and so that's what I thought, life pictures. And then I did something a little bit different, as your professors will tell you, to what hasn't been done yet. And I looked at it in a way, a geographic way, and used some theory from geography, which was different. I don't think I found one person in England that had written a couple papers on that type of research. So that became the topic of my book. Was there another question, or?
No, just an overview. So.
Yeah. So the most challenging part was to get primary sources, and I was fortunate to find an editor and a couple photographers that were still alive. I used Life magazine, which is all digitized and online now. I also went to the Library of Congress and looked at the papers of Henry Luce. I would have loved to have gotten into the archives at Life, but they are like Fort Knox and very hard to get into. My experience was a challenge, and I think you had mentioned it was an obsession. It became an obsession in the sense that I really wanted to do it. And I think that when you pick a topic, it needs to be close to an obsession, so that when you're really, really down and you don't want to look at it, you love it so much and you're interested in it so much that pushes you forward. So that's kind of, thank you.
Okay. Good morning. I'm really happy to be here at this conference in this beautiful facility. Really gorgeous. So this is my first time at this conference, so I'm very excited. And I haven't talked about this book in a while, and not from this particular angle. So this is going to be interesting for me. I hope it'll be interesting for you. First, just a little bit about my book. It combines a couple of different approaches. Biography, which I'll talk about a little bit, also photo history, and visual analysis. So let me say a couple of things about the biography part of it. This is the story of Hansel Mee, who you probably haven't heard of. And so let me say a little bit about who she is. Her given name was Johanna, and she was born in Germany in 1909, and she died in Santa Rosa, California in 1998. Throughout her life, Mee rebelled against conventions and considered herself an outsider. And I think that was certainly true in her career at Life magazine. She was an outsider when she was hired in 1937, and I think she struggled with working at that magazine because it was so commercial and it was so politically sort of antithetical to what she stood for, which was labor rights and the rights of immigrants and that sort of thing. So one of the things that sort of got me interested in her and propelled me to stick with the project was just this idea of a contradiction and the tension between her ideals and her vision as a photographer and what she ended up being able to create and realize in her career at Life. So she wanted to study medicine, going back a little bit to her early life in Germany. She wanted to study medicine, but her family was too poor to send her to high school, really, certainly not to college or beyond. So she, one of her early rebellions was deciding that she would not work at a garment factory for the rest of her life. And so she left home and instead decided to be a vagabond for several years, just traveling around Europe and picking up money by playing music or writing poems or taking photographs, whatever she could do to pick up a little money. She was a busker, I guess. And then she traveled around with Otto Hegel, who was also a photographer, who turned out to be her mentor and eventually became a freelance photographer with Life and Fortune and other magazines. So they shared the photography and they shared a life as spouses eventually. And it was during her vagabond existence that she adopted the name Hansel, and it was part of a larger ruse where she was posing as Otto Hegel's little brother in order to avoid being harassed or sexually assaulted as a young woman on the road. it works sometimes, but not 100%. Anyway, she immigrated to New York in 1929 and eventually joined Hegel in San Francisco. And San Francisco was where she lived for the next few years. They obtained a secondhand camera and started taking pictures of their friends and fellow migrant farm workers, waterfront workers, and just people they knew in Chinatown and North Beach and different San Francisco neighborhoods. The waterfront photographs got her the position at Life because she was able to get some really dramatic pictures of strikes on the San Francisco waterfront. And there was some violence that broke out there, and she had access that other photographers didn't have because the longshoremen trusted her and knew her and her husband. Not her husband then, but anyway, so that was sort of the start of her relationship with time and life. And Peter Stackpole, who was a photographer at Life for many years, was a friend of hers and sort of opened the door. So she had a unique point of view which made her attractive to Life, but also eventually I think was her undoing as well. Let me say a couple of things about her perspective. She had a divided perspective, and I think this idea of a divided perspective is kind of familiar to a lot of people who study journalists of color and immigrant journalists. So I'm going to quote from Terrence Pitts, who was the director of the Center for Creative Photography at the University of Arizona, which is where her archives are housed. Terrence Pitts wrote, "Partly because emigre photographers looked at America with fresh eyes, and partly because the America they found did not correspond to the America they expected, their work often addressed the issues that haunt this country: poverty, injustice, and intolerance." And so that sort of brings me to her photographic vision and what it had to do with the topic of this panel, which is civil rights. Let me say a quick thing about her photographic vision, too. She was also shaped by trauma in her photographic vision and the way that she interacted with her subjects. She and Hegel had a daughter who died very young after being struck by a truck in a migrant labor camp. And this loss really left me traumatized and guilt-ridden for a long period of time. Eventually, I think it shaped her as a photographer. She had this unique empathy with her subjects, especially when they were women, children, of other people who she identified with as outsiders in some way. And she had a particular way of putting people at ease and sort of blending into the background herself, not being a really directing kind of presence. So she's been compared to Margaret Bourke-White in the sense that Margaret Bourke-White was very sort of aggressive and curious in a relationship with her subjects, directing them and so forth, whereas Meath was quite the opposite. Okay, so that's a brief overview of the biographical part, at least the first biographical part. The other side of Women Workers and Race and Life magazine is photo history and visual analysis. So she belongs to a group of women who excelled in photojournalism in the 30s and early 40s, which I think are now seen as the golden age of photojournalism in some ways. And there were other women who were coming to have their histories told after a long period of silence. Louise Roscoe is one of those. A colleague at James Madison has written a book about her and her work. So let me say a couple of things about her stories at one of them. Some notes over here, which I've got to do. Am I doing a pen Not so much.
No.
Okay. Well, then I'll just end there by saying that she did take some photographs that dealt with Harlem. Here's a photograph from a chapter on Harlem of the sculptor Augustus Savage. So the civil rights movement sort of was not, she was not active in what we consider the civil rights movement, but I think she was sort of a proto-civil rights photographer. And one of the things that I found in my research was that she was very attuned to her unusual place, and she was very uncomfortable with her status as a white photographer covering the story, and said that by all rights, the Harlem story that she did should have been covered by a black photographer. at the same time, she was really thrilled to be working with Augusta Savage and other artists and labor leaders in Harlem. So she had a very ambivalent relationship with life and a very ambivalent relationship with some of her subjects. But she loved telling the stories of people who were immigrants and outsiders, like Augusta Savage. So thank you.
My book, or my upcoming book, is about a civil rights movement that began in South Carolina in the 1930s, won a significant string of victories in the 40s, and came under fierce attack from a white segregationist counter-movement in the 1950s. Now, I'm hardly the first to write about these events or to note these events, but my book tries to view the civil rights movement of that time through a new lens, one that moves journalists from the periphery to the center of the political action. Between the 30s and 60s, I contend that the black and white journalists were distinct political actors who engaged directly in the state's political process and helped shape the battle over social and political change in South Carolina. I argue that the African-American newspaper, the Lighthouse and Informer, and its editor, John Henry McCrae, deserve more attention in the history of the black press. At a time when black newspapers in the Deep South were believed to be cautious and conservative, much like the Scott family's Atlanta Daily World in Atlanta, the Lighthouse and Informer called for direct challenge to white supremacy. The paper demanded that black South Carolinians rebel and fight for their rights, that they reject the slavery of thought and action that created Uncle Tom's and Aunt Jemima's and become progressive fighters for the emancipation of the race. This was in the early 40s. In 1939 and 1940, McCrae essentially merged his newspaper with a reinvigorated NAACP in the state, establishing a model for black activism that would become commonplace in the mass movements that overthrew the Jim Crow regime in the South in the late 50s and early 60s. And in 1944, McCrae used his newspaper to launch a political insurgency that opened the Democratic Party to black voters in the South, a move which helped alter politics in the state and in the nation. Also, equally important, I argue that the white press played a central role in organizing the resistance to this civil rights movement in South Carolina. Yes, they editorialized in favor of segregation and presented narratives designed to undermine the fight for political and social equality. But the white editors were also political players themselves, particularly in planning and executing the so-called massive resistance campaign of the 1950s. They helped create the White Citizens Council movement, and when that and massive resistance began to fail, they turned to partisan politics and helped create a new political home for white segregationists in the conservative wing of the Republican Party. Working with conservative movement leaders in the North, particularly William F. Buckley and his magazine National Review, white journalists from South Carolina helped develop the colorblind rhetoric that would help attract segregationists to the conservative cause without alienating their northern supporters. This was across the 60s and particularly on into the 70s and 80s. And I'll end this brief summary of the book with this thought. The political activism that I've described of the black press is, I think, taken for granted. We often describe black newspapers and magazines as a fighting press, but we rarely make such claims about the white mainstream media. Journalists have often discouraged such scrutiny by downplaying their role in the political process. And I should know, because I used to do that when I was a journalist as well. But the evidence from South Carolina suggests that the professionalization narrative that is so prominent in journalism history warrants closer scrutiny and closer study. The white journalists from South Carolina of that time period were certainly extreme examples. But I argue that they should not be seen as anomalies in an era of an otherwise nonpartisan objective press. This book tries to take seriously the notion that journalists often serve as political actors who frequently shape public opinion and sometimes wield instrumental power in the democratic process. Thanks, and I look forward to questions.
Okay, thank you very much. What a great group of authors. I have a couple of questions that I want to toss out, and then we'll open it up for discussion with the audience, because I know that you all have questions as well. Some of you, in your opening, your overview remarks, have mentioned archives, and I'm very much interested in archives. And I did notice, James talked about Ethel Payne's papers being scattered to and fro, and he said 4 archives. I think I counted 6 or 7 in his endnotes. But in any case, that would be challenging. And I'm interested in any sort of challenges you confronted in doing your books, something that you didn't expect to find, something that was missing, something that you had to accommodate for, those kinds of things. And I'm going to start with Sonja, because you were doing radio, and which is totally ethereal. Happily, your subject was a writer, but if you could talk about the archive that supports your book.
I love doing research, that's the first thing. So one of my friends said after a few years of just trying to track leads down, it was like, when are you going to write? Since you've kind of gone through all these changes. But in terms of radio, it was really difficult to find audio examples of his work from the early 40s. He got into radio because he was a child of the Depression, and he got his first job. Literally, his first full-time job was working for the Illinois Writers Project and the WPA. And in the Illinois Writers Project, there was a radio division, and they were tasked, the writers in that division were tasked with writing scripts for 15-minute dramas that aired on local stations. Mm-hmm. So I couldn't find any audio from his work in the late 30s and early 40s, but what did exist, because the Illinois Writers Project was funded by the WPA, and because it was a federally funded program, all of his scripts exist either in the Library of Congress or the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, because they had to save everything. And so that was a treasure trove of just writing the script, and to see his growth from his first script all the way to when he left. In terms of Destination Freedom, even though it was recorded, it actually was performed live in WMAQ's studio, but it was recorded. And so those recordings existed in archives both in Chicago. Mrs. Durham, his wife, who's still alive, and she's 98, soon to be 98 this year, had some tapes. And also at the Schomburg, they had tapes of the show. So I could hear almost all of the shows, but more importantly, or as importantly, all of the scripts existed. So I could read every script from the first to the last.
I couldn't imagine writing a book about someone in radio whose voice I did not know.
Well, but see, he was not an ordinary personality. He was literally not just. He was the writer. He was the creator. So you would never have heard him on the air. His voice came through his actors, okay. And he worked with professional actors. These were not just anyone. People like Oscar Brown Jr., Studs Terkel. We know him as a writer, but he in the 30s and 40s was an actor on radio. Right. So there was that, and I was able to find that. Later on, in the late 60s, early 70s, Durham had a television show that aired on PBS. It was probably the first black dramatic series on public television. And in searching for the tapes of the series, it was almost a losing battle, because it was on WTTW. And they threw out all of the tapes except for 2. So I was able to find those 2 and at least look at those. But again, the scripts existed. And Richard Durham's papers are in the Chicago Public Library. But he, because of his relationships with people like Langston Hughes, I found through Langston Hughes' papers, through Arnold Bontem's papers, correspondence between the two.
Okay, good. So, Sid, you were kind of saying yes, archives.
You talked about particular problems. One, in researching John McCrae's newspapers, there's one huge problem. The paper folded because of tax, because it went into bankruptcy. It was sold off for back taxes in 1954, and the archive, what had been saved in the newspaper, was ground up and sold for scrap. And so there were, for a while, there were almost no editions available. Through the hard work of some people here and in Belgium, of all places, we won't get into details on why, but about 50 editions have been recovered over the years. And so there are about 50 full editions, plus, so there are those. Fortunately, as I have to make an argument in the book about, is that enough to really understand what the paper was doing? Can you get an accurate idea? Fortunately, those 50 do cover key periods. It's almost like great fortune. Key periods across the 14 years that the paper was actually published, and key moments, political moments during those years. So I can make that argument. Plus, I could supplement that by going and looking in other places, in personal papers, John McCrae's personal papers, but also white journalists like William Workman and Thomas Waring, and white politicians like former governor here, James F. Burns, former a lot of things, but he was former governor here. And during that time, he was in a feud with the Lighthouse and Informer. And in his personal papers, you can find several editions of the paper there. So I found articles from there. Also, the Atlanta Daily World, a more conservative newspaper, but also a really kind of contradictory and confusing newspaper in many ways, would republish editorials from papers around the South and republish several John McCrae editorials. So it really helped fill it out as well. So you could piece together a pretty good look at what McCrae was doing, but initially I thought, well, it's not worth looking into that paper, because there's just not enough of them left to study. But I think I've argued that there were just enough.
Yeah, a lot of legwork involved for you. So.
A lot of help from people who worked before me, like Bim Ruths, who is a former, you may know him, Rick. Bim Ruths was a master's student in the SJMC, and then I think he was in the history department for a while. He did work on the Lighthouse Informer before I did, and he did yeoman work in finding and making sure that the Caroliniana had about 15 editions that were in Ghent, Belgium, because of an ally of McCrae. I won't go into details; it doesn't matter. But so in the acknowledgments, I know, Bim Ruths was really important to his work. Allowed me to do my work, so I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
The archives. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. It's for exploring the archives exist apart from white archives in the United States. So the archivists get different kind of training, which means they get different kinds of networking. If you worked on books like I have at Columbia University Archives, Harvard, Library of Congress, every archivist you meet belongs to the same social club. They have the same funds to tap. It's a network. And that's not the case in African American archives. They were built out of a legacy of segregation. The archivists have a very different culture, very different training, and very different access to money. And we're going to lose a large segment of American history unless we focus some attention on them. And the second thing is that because they exist apart, they're not on the traveling path of traditional white American historians. So if you open up histories of civil rights written by historians, only in recent years have they started including things from the Defender or from Durham or from Payne or people like that. I mean, Bob Caro, the biographer of LBJ, was the first to quote Payne in what I would call a traditional white biography. He quoted him in her attacks on Johnson when he was trying to do the 1957 Civil Rights Act. The point I'm making is not that pain needs to be front and center. All of the people we're talking about on that side of the fight for desegregation are still segregated from American history, and in part, that's because of the condition of the archives, the training, the culture, and the lack of money.
I would say that my experience, I've been several times to the Fisk University archives, and there is wonderful material there. There's a lot of material related to Du Bois that is there, and I also was there looking at Charles Johnson's papers, and was surprised to know that the archive for the Race Relations Institute has not been sorted through or indexed. It's in storage because they don't have the resources to process and to make it available for public use. But it's a wonderful place, and you can take your lunch break and go walk around in administration buildings and see murals by Aaron Douglas, who was the art department chair, and I found, going through Johnson's papers, I found a memo, a book order signed by Arna Bontom, who was the librarian, and it's just a wonderful place. But I agree. Thank you for saying that. So I would like to now talk. I've saved the life, people, because you're dealing with a different kind of archive, but it may have presented challenges. Maybe it was too processed. I don't know. But can you talk about your experience? I know you access some things digitally, and you were in Arizona using the papers of your subject. So could you talk about working on a project that involved life? So.
Well, as Michael said earlier, Life is famously inaccessible with their official archives. They do not welcome researchers into their archives. So I had to depend on, and that made it even more galling when I had to get money to pay for the copyright fees, which were considerable, to pay for those photographs that had been previously published in Life magazine. So that meant that I had to get creative, and yes, the Center for Creative Photography is where the papers and some of the photographs of Neath and Hagel are housed, but that's certainly not a complete collection, because a lot of photographers in Hansel Meath's day turned over their photographs. If they were staff photographers, they turned over their work to Life. They did not own it, and so the Otto Hagel collection is a lot richer at the Center for Creative Photography because he was a freelancer as opposed to Hansel, who was a staff photographer. So there were issues with access, and I feel like I only sort of scratched the surface of the photographic archive. But I did visit, I actually visited the South Caroliniana collection to access the papers of John Shaw Billings, who was her managing editor. And that is a very fascinating collection, which includes a diary, handwritten diary of his that he kept for decades. I only read, maybe 5-7 years worth of his diaries during the time that he was actually supervising her. Very interesting, but also challenging because of his handwriting. And because he would go off on these very personal tangents about family members and relatives and old grudges, and it was very revealing about some of his prejudices, which were profound. And I also visited labor archives at the University of San Francisco and labor archives at Cornell, where the garment workers have their archives, and also did a story on the Garment Workers Union. So for me, one of my big challenges was her status as somebody who was not a conventional writer. She did take up writing later in life, but she was primarily a photographer. And she also had that lifestyle that did not lend itself to collecting in an organized fashion. Her her memories and her papers. So the collection is very incomplete, and I had to rely a lot on oral histories. And if those of you who have not, audience who have dealt with oral histories know that they are a great resource, but they're also a challenging one because they, especially if they're oral histories that were recorded later in life, you have to account for the vagaries of memory and the reliability of the person, especially if she suffered a stroke or 2 or 3, as in the case of Consuelo. So there were a lot of interesting and challenging things that I can deal with in the way of archives and oral histories.
Yeah, I had a similar experience in the sense that life was huge, and I didn't look at just one photographer. I looked at a bunch of photographers throughout time. Life had an army of photographers, both on the staff and photographers that they used as freelancers in contract. And those, it was really difficult because they were all over the place. Some of them were in some collection, some of them the photographer died and they got donated somewhere. So that was a little bit more interesting in finding who owned the copyright. On the cover, I found the photographer. He was a student in Richmond, actually, when he took the cover picture of my book, and I tracked him down. He lives in Germany, and he's still alive. And he was very, very kind and gave me the story of what happened. Life had a news section every week, what was going on in the news, and his picture just ran in that section with a bunch of other pictures. And he said that I could use it on his cover. He gave me the story of what was going on. He actually even sent me more images that weren't published. And I think that over time, if you're doing research where people are still alive, I think they're usually very open to helping and clearing and speaking about what actually happened. So that was just the one photographer that I found that was still alive. Most of them have passed away.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience. This has been fascinating. You may pose questions to the panel. You may direct questions to individual folks.
I just had a general question. 3 of you were teaching. And it occurred to me that the technology must take some of the romance out of doing research these days. When you talk to doctoral students, if you work with them, do you have some concerns about the fact that maybe a lot of the kinds of things you're all doing are more easily accessed, just sitting on your ass, in a chair someplace, and it sort of takes the romance out of it, being a little bit voyeuristic and the lessons you learn just by doing the footwork. Or students even want to do this kind of stuff anymore? But just a kind of general question.
It is an interesting question. I am someone who I concede that I do enjoy the romance of digging through the actual papers and coming across letters and things that were actually written, the dusty documents, as it were. But I'm not going to kid you that when I come across a digitized archive, I'm not unhappy about it. The fact that I can sit on my ass in Minnesota. So it's a mixed bag there, which is pretty much how I view all of digital technology. I love it, I use it, but I also love print newspapers and old magazines too. So there's
no love lost when it comes to the old microfilm.
Oh, God.
No.
And I use it. Yeah, that I can do without. I do love just seeing the handwritten documents. I think you can see this bad handwriting. The old handwritten document, there's something really, and I saved way too many of them, copies of them.
It's
just
so
for my
satisfying
own.
when you
Like,
decipher
who are you going to
it.
show these to? Nobody's going to care, but I just find them interesting.
Yeah, it's part of the obsession, I think. And I just did a search of John Shaw Billings' papers here in Columbia, And I was sort of happy to see that they haven't been digitized. You still have to go do it the old-fashioned way. And I'm sure there are many collections that will never be digitized because they're too extensive or too obscure or whatever the reason is. And there will always be obsessive people who love to bury themselves in the archives and get lost in the history. I hope, although I don't work with document students, so
I do worry about keyword searches and missing things that serendipitously you would come across. I mean, sometimes you find things when you're looking for something else,
right.
And that's
Well, just a
dangerous.
side note,
Just
I noticed in some of the presentations, which I love, is that you would show, for example, some of the correspondence that was in one of the presentations yesterday. I was surprised that folks would write letters. Take the commander, the retired Army admiral. He chose to write his letter on a letterhead from some voluntary group. And see, to me, that's communicative. I think that's very interesting. Is that retained in a lot of these digital? Do you get the whole thing?
They're
The postmark,
yeah.
that it was postmarked, I thought it was. And I thought, isn't that interesting, how many people are writing? Because that implies to me that that person who wrote that letter thinks he or she is acting as a voice for that interest group or public.
I know there's a couple of graduate students in the audience here, and I know that at least a couple of you, your books came from your dissertation work. Could you talk a little bit about the process? You finish your dissertation, everybody's woohoo, and then moving it from the dissertation to a published book for the world at large. How much additional work did you do? How difficult was it? How different is the book that is finally published to what you wrote as your dissertation?
So I was fortunate in the fact that my chair of my dissertation was Pat Washburn, who is a very well-known historian, and he actually said that he would help me write it as a book, which was amazing because I don't think I could have done it without him. But most dissertations the criteria is different than a book. So when in my situation, after it was done as a dissertation, I changed it a little bit for a more wider audience, and then when it was reviewed, I had to change it even more. It wasn't that distressing because I think that when I set out in the beginning with it in mind, and Pat kind of helped me, it was easy. But I know that that's not the case, I think, in most places. I think that a dissertation committee wants specific things covered, which is not necessarily what a publisher wants. So.
it was similar. I too had a fabulous advisor, Kathy Robbins Ford, and so I came out with the main arguments and the main, at least the first sort of pass at evidence supporting those arguments. But I realized that there was much more in the archives that I had not really gone through. And there were other archives I really needed to spend time. The NAACP papers at the Library of Congress, I really needed to spend time there. And so once I got into those archives, well, I saw that there was an even richer story here, and so I had to rethink. And so I ended up doing a lot of work on it. But I didn't change the main arguments, the main thrust that came out of the dissertations there. I just think there's more evidence now, and that evidence has led me in some different directions, but not radically so. And also just revising it and revising it and revising it so that it reads, that somebody could actually read it.
I think it's important for graduate students to know that this idea that the dissertation is something specific to meet certain criteria, and the book has to have a stronger narrative. And I think that dissertation chairs do their students a great service if they allow them to start experimenting with that narrative while they're writing the dissertation, and don't insist that it be chunk, lit review, that sort of thing, because it all has to be synthesized. This will make graduate students unhappy to know this, but one of the things that is probably going to happen is that lit review that you have spent so much time developing is well, you can just pretty much highlight and recopy that to something else and start embedding that information in footnotes and that sort of thing. But I too went back. I started with a dissertation, and I went back and I worked for another 3 years. I basically went to lots more archives, and I also was doing oral history interviews, and probably did 12 more after my dissertation was finished.
Also, I don't know how this will play, but just from my own view now that I have graduate students, I believe that dissertations are meant to get done. You know, and I mean, there's having a deadline and pushing. It needs to be good and it needs to be done. And that means that therefore, if it's going to be a book, there's probably more work to be done that you didn't have to have. It's just a necessity for the dissertation. You got the degree, you got the dissertation, now you need to go and turn that into a book by doing that extra work. But just people who linger and linger and linger on dissertations, that's deadly, as I understand it, for career, for future. I mean, that's
Well, Gwyneth was a case in point, by the way. Gwyneth was a doctoral student in our program for more years than I can remember. And then he migrated to history.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if he ever finished his dissertation, but he did some great work.
I thought he did.
But,
poor them. I raised his name and now he's disparaged. I wanted to honor the man.
well, no, and I'm sure he did good work, but not under the aegis of our program. Some other
So
place.
I'd like to hear from James, whose approaches, we've just been talking about dissertations, and a lot of people in the room have one in the past or the present or the future. And you write mini books about history, and so you're approaching this work in a different way. And so I would imagine that when you're making a decision about, well, for example, Ethel Payne, you talked earlier about identifying an opportunity there. No one else was doing her biography. But I would imagine that you would also need to be persuaded that there was a story there to tell that could sustain hundreds of pages.
Yeah, well, my dissertations are meant for editors. And, you know, I run across great stories frequently. And I send the idea to my agent, and I get a letter back, and it says, "Did you hear that found?" Long pause. That was head in the desk. The problem for me is it has to be commercially supported. I earn my living doing this. And when I approached my patient about doing the biography of Ethel Payne, he said to me, "Well, I can sell it if you want." And I think you're going to understand what that meant. I earned less money for doing this book than anything I've done in play. But I thought it was socially important, and my wife and I agreed that that's what we do. My new book that's out this week is about Hemingway and Dos Passos, so you can see it in preparing to find readers to make the legit work. So there's a cruelty to this in that you have to have commercial support, which means that a lot of important stories about the civil rights era are not going to work because publishers won't believe it's a market. Traditional publishers, HarperCollins, who published that book, they moved that book to Amistad, which is one part of HarperCollins that specializes in books of black interest. And they rarely do they then publish a book under the main line if it involves black history or black figure. And so the blame is the publishers' approach themselves, that the market itself is not exposing readers to these stories. And it's very frustrating. I'd love to do some more books like this. To be honest, I can't afford it.
I want to piggyback on Jenny's point because I initially wanted to go with a commercial publisher for my book. And so I tried to find agents, and the agent said, "Hey, sounds interesting, but we don't know if we can sell it." and you may want to go to a university press. And I kept pushing, and finally I said, okay, if I'm getting all these rejections, then I probably need to go to a university press. And the University of Illinois Press has been great. They've really been supportive and all, but I had hoped to go more commercial. And yet, even with the university press, and I think everybody on this panel will say the same thing, including you, is that when it once the book is done and it's then about ready to come out, it's on the author to get the word out, because the money and the support for publicity is like nothing or barely anything. And so when this book came out, I just had set up all these possibilities of going to talk about the book and exposing. And people looked at my schedule and said, well, did the press do this? And I said, no, it was on me. And one of the things is obviously dealing with your network. I worked at NPR, so NPR and radio, that's it. Newspapers, I have newspaper contacts. I used to work at a paper. So it really is, if you're going to write a book, you should also, as one friend of mine told me, and I never believed her because I thought it was so hard writing a book and doing the research and getting it together and then figuring out how the narrative was going to be structured. But she said, you think writing is hard? Try to publicize it and get it sold. And now I see that she was right, but it really takes almost another campaign to really get the word out. Is that what you found?
Okay, other questions?
I had some just specific individual questions I was looking on. Ms. Williams, when you were talking about the transition between radio, but he was writing for radio, so I guess he was still writing on newspapers. Did he ever talk about feeling that he had more of an impact in one medium or the other, or why he switched, or if he just, did he ever come back to radio? Because they're both very powerful mediums, and it seemed like he worked them very well. But did he kind of have a preference to one or the other, or?
As I said, once I really found out what his trajectory was, he knew from the time he was in his 20s that he wanted to make a living as a writer. He didn't want to work in any other field. But the thing that he did was he knew he had to be versatile enough so that when one door closed, he went to another. I don't think he consciously said, oh, I'm going to work in newspapers, now I'm going to work in radio, and then television, and then print. It was the opportunities presented themselves, or he was fired because he was an activist. So he pissed off his bosses a lot of times. In fact, Destination Freedom had won so many awards and was popular in Chicago. He wanted for Destination Freedom to what happened with Amos and Andy, because it was at the same station. Amos and Andy became so popular on WMAQ that a year later, after it was on that station, they went national on NBC, and it became a phenomenal hit. He felt Destination Freedom could have the same trajectory, but NBC said no. And the reasons why they said no is here in the book. But in essence, he ended up suing NBC because they appropriated his show and made it about all white actors and said that they owned the copyright. As a result of his suing, he could no longer work in radio, so he had to go into other fields. And I think it was a question of his activism, his voice, his strong conviction that you should use your words to not only organize, but in the service of freedom and justice. And so I think he had to move into various areas. And he was versatile enough that he could adjust.
I did have one more for Mr. Sid, Mr. Baker. When you were coming across the difference in white and black coverage in newspapers, did you see an imagery difference as far as like accompanying photographs? Was there any notable significance or difference between depictions and images within newspapers between the white and black press in your observation?
Absolutely. I think this is certainly been noted. Anyone who's really studied the white press, and certainly the white press in the mid-20th century, would see this, but I certainly saw that. And the white newspapers rarely had any African Americans, especially in the 40s. In the 40s in South Carolina, which I have several, I go into this a bit, sort of just culturally how they were covering. The white press in South Carolina was led by a sort of a paternalistic conservative view, an old aristocratic conservatism, which put it didn't really fear a civil rights movement because they didn't think African Americans would actually do that. And they thought they were inherently inferior and that they would never really challenge a rule. And so they were treated in the press as a point of ridicule. There was the State, became the largest newspaper in the country in the 40s, and it used to run a cartoon every day called Ham Bone. It was like a Sambo cartoon written in dialect. It ran every day. It was really just awful. The black press, and McRae was very much in the tradition of the rest of the black press, ran pictures of black America all over the country, and particularly all over the South. We just saw the documentary about historically black colleges and universities, and he would run pictures of the Morehouse graduating class, the pictures of the Bennett graduating class, obviously the schools here, but the schools all around the South. There were pictures of black Americans doing everyday things, doing heroic things, and they would run obviously pictures of black Americans registering to vote and things like that. White press ignored them almost entirely in the 40s, except as a point of derision and as criminal suspects. And then in the 50s began to paint them as communists, but still didn't run many pictures of them. So they were sort of they did not appear in the white press very much.
Was McRae getting his information about things that were going on outside of South Carolina from the Associated Negro Press in Chicago?
Yeah, he was deeply. He would attend also the national convention. He did syndicate that material, so he had that material. And then he had relationships too, as I said, with the Atlanta Daily World, which printed his newspaper for a while. And so, yeah, he was hooked into the ANC.
We're almost out of time. Are there any pressing questions? Because I have one more for the panelists. James, you've said that your book on Hemingway and Dos Passos is coming out. Do you have another one in the chute that you're starting to work on?
Well, it's kind of actually I'm doing what Sonja as well. In a few hours, I'm in a bookstore trying to persuade people to buy the new book. So X is trying to run around the country. I'll be in California, New York, about this book.
Okay.
So sorry. I just want to point out something I think really interesting, and I'll do it in 30 seconds. Listen to Sonja and others about Meath, the professor named by Durham and Payne. These are folks who all come from backgrounds with early exposure to injustice, and they all turn to journalism to use it as a means to rectify that justice. And secondly, the parallel between Durham and Payne I always find fascinating is, unlike white journalists, they immediately saw the international aspects of the black freedom struggle. And I think in a conference looking at media history and civil rights history, these two folks, as well as some of the others, are examples of how broad their thinking was and how unappreciated it is today.
Thank you. Now, is anybody else already imagining the next book?
And it will be a bestseller.
Okay.
Again, the press and its role in politics and civil rights, 65 to 80, basically.
When I'm looking at affirmative action in higher education, longitudinal study of how it affected black students as students and then in their careers.
I'm not telling
All right. Well, we had a wonderful discussion here, and I appreciate everyone being here, also virtually. Thank you, James, and let's give it all.